Chapter 18. Standing and Digging. "What are you doing here?" Ben Weatherstaff shouted at Mary. "You shouldn't have gone poking your nose back here. This garden is off limits. Lord Craven has ordered—" He stopped suddenly when he saw Colin. "Good Lord," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ben looked as if he'd seen a ghost. "Wheel me over there," Colin demanded from his chair. Dickon pushed the carriage over to the wall. "Do you know who I am?" Colin bellowed at the gardener. Ben Weatherstaff couldn't answer. He just stared and stared at Colin. Then he rubbed his eyes and stared again. In a shaky voice he answered, "It could only be you, Master Craven. I would know those eyes anywhere. They were the eyes of your mother. But I thought you were too crippled to be moved from the manor." Colin sat as straight and tall as possible. "I am not a cripple," he cried out furiously. "He's not," Mary agreed. "I looked for a lump on his back. He doesn't have any." Ben Weatherstaff wiped his brow nervously. "You don't have a crooked back?" he asked. "No," Colin shouted. "And you don't have crooked legs?" The humiliation was more than Colin could bear. Mary watched as her friend's face turned red. She knew that being accused of having crooked legs was bound to make Colin wild with anger. She silently prayed that he wouldn't have another fit. Instead of screaming at Ben Weatherstaff, Colin surprised them all by pulling the blankets off his legs. "Dickon," he called out, "come here." Dickon ran to his friend. Mary watched as Colin grabbed Dickon's arms and hoisted himself out of the chair. She held her breath when Colin's feet touched the ground. Then she smiled from ear to ear. Colin was standing upright. "Look at me," Colin cried to Ben Weatherstaff. "Just look at me." "He's as straight as I am," Dickon called out. "He's as straight as any boy." Mary looked up at Ben Weatherstaff and was surprised to see he was crying. "You're a fine lad," the gardener cried. "God bless you." Colin held Dickon's arms tightly, but he didn't stumble or fall. He stood straighter and straighter with each passing moment and looked Ben Weatherstaff in the face. "I am your master when my father is away," he said, "and you are to obey me. This is my garden. You cannot tell anybody about it. Get down from your ladder and come into the garden. You will have to be let in on our secret." When Ben Weatherstaff was out of sight, Colin turned to his friends. "I can stand," he said proudly. "I knew you could," Dickon cheered. "You just had to stop being afraid," Mary added. Colin beamed at his friends and drew himself up straighter. "I'm going to walk to that tree," he announced, pointing to a tree a few feet away. "I want to be standing there when Ben Weatherstaff comes." Colin walked to the tree and, though Dickon held his arm, he stood strong. He held himself straight so he looked tall. "Look at me," Colin called to Ben Weatherstaff. "Do you see a boy with a crooked back? Do you see a boy with crooked legs?" "No, sir," Ben Weatherstaff replied. Colin cleared his throat. "This is my garden now," he said. "I will come here every day, but it is to be kept a secret. My orders are that no one is to know that we come here. Dickon and my cousin have worked hard to make this garden come alive. I don't want to spoil it for them." Ben Weatherstaff nodded and looked around. "Your mother loved this garden so," he said quietly. "She once told me, 'Ben, if I'm ever ill or go away, you must take care of my roses.' And I did. Every year I came over the wall and did a bit of pruning. But ever since my arthritis, I haven't been able to." "That's why it was so wick," Dickon remarked. "I'm glad you kept your promise to my mother," Colin told him. "You know how to keep a secret." Colin slowly dropped to his knees, but when Dickon ran over to help him, Colin waved him away. "I want to dig too," he announced, grabbing a trowel from the dirt. Slowly, he began to scratch at the earth with the trowel. "Look, I'm digging, standing, walking, and digging all in one day." The sun began to set in the secret garden. The last thing Colin did on that first day of his new life was plant a rose for his mother. When the sun finally dropped below the wall of the garden, Colin again stood on his own 2 feet.